The wind howled through the empty streets as a small German shepherd puppy staggered through the snow, his tiny paws leaving faint imprints in the thick blanket of white. His fur was matted, his breathing labored, and his eyes wide with fear. He was searching for something, someone. His only thought was to find help, and his path led him straight to Officer Sarah Matthews, who had just stepped out of her patrol car. The puppy's desperate whimper cut through the silence of the night, and Sarah's heart immediately went out to him. She crouched down, slowly reaching out to comfort him, but the puppy didn't want comfort. He wanted something more. With trembling legs, he nudged her hand, then turned, looking back at her as if pleading for her to follow something. In his gaze struck Sarah deeply, an urgency in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. Max, the German shepherd puppy, had been wandering for what felt like an eternity. His body was exhausted, and his small frame trembled as he trudged through the thick snow, dragging his injured paw. Every step he took was a battle against the cold, but his resolve never wavered. He was on a mission. The memory of his mother, Roxy, lying injured in the woods, was enough to fuel his desperate search for help. When Officer Sarah Matthews saw the puppy limping toward her, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The puppy's eyes were wide with panic, and his movements were erratic. He stumbled to a stop just in front of her. His breathing labored as he called, collapsed at her feet. Sarah knelt down to check on him, and that's when she saw the blood. His paw was bruised and swollen, and there was a slight tremble in his small body. "Hey there, buddy," Sarah said softly, reaching down to pet him. She could tell he was scared, but there was something more. He wasn't just lost, he was searching for something or someone. She gently lifted him in her arms, feeling the weight of his desperation as she held him. Max looked up at her with those wide, pleading eyes, then turned his head and started walking away from her, looking back to make sure she was following. Sarah, puzzled, hesitated for a moment, but then made the decision to follow. Something in his movements, in the way he kept looking back, told her that he wasn't just lost, he was leading her somewhere. Max led her through the snow, his small body fighting against the biting cold, but his determination never faltering. Sarah followed closely behind, her heart heavy with concern for the little puppy. As they moved deeper into the quiet snow-covered streets, the world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their footsteps in the snow and the puppy's quiet whimper. After a few minutes, Max stopped in front of an old deserted alley, his head turning back to look at Sarah. His body shook, but he didn't stop. He pointed his nose toward the alley and whined again, this time with an intensity that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Something wasn't right. "Max," she whispered softly, her voice trembling with concern, "where are you leading me?" Max turned and walked into the alley, but the air was thick with tension. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her instincts telling her something was wrong, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. She had to trust the puppy. As she stepped into the alley, the first thing she saw was a trail of blood leading into the darkness. Max turned to face her, his eyes wide with fear. He let out a low whine, looking down the dark alley as though urging her to hurry. Sarah's heart raced as she followed Max down the dark alley, the wind howling through the narrow passage, sending shivers down her spine. The puppy's small body trembled with each step, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Sarah could sense his anxiety, but there was no turning back now. The trail of blood in the snow was unmistakable, and every instinct told her that they were getting closer to something crucial. The alley opened up into a small clearing at the edge of a wooded area where the trees stood like silent sentinels in the growing twilight. Snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes, the world around them turning to a blur of white. Sarah squinted into the distance, but the wind and snow made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Max stopped in his tracks and Sarah's heart sank as she saw what had caught his attention there. Lying in the snow was a German shepherd, her fur matted with snow and her body motionless. Her breathing was shallow, but Sarah could tell that she was still alive. The blood around her paws told a heartbreaking story. Roxy, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible against the wind. She didn't need to know the dog's name to feel the weight of the moment. The sight of the injured German shepherd, who had clearly been through so much, was overwhelming. Max patted over to the injured dog, his body shaking as he nudged her gently with his nose. Roxy lifted her head slowly, her tired eyes meeting Sarah's. There was no mistaking the pain in her gaze, but there was also something else, a glimmer of trust, a faint hope that Sarah might be able to help. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she crouched down beside Roxy, gently reaching out to touch her. The dog whimpered softly but didn't flinch. Max, now by Sarah's side, pressed his body close to hers as if seeking comfort, his eyes never leaving his mother's. Sure, it's okay, Sarah whispered softly, brushing snow from Roxy's fur. I'm here to help. Just hang on. Her mind raced as she assessed the situation. The storm had been relentless, and it was clear that Roxy had been out here for far too long. Her paw was badly injured and her body was too weak to stand on its own, but despite the severe condition she was in, there was a will to survive in her eyes. Roxy wasn't giving up, not yet. Max's eyes were wide with worry as he looked at Sarah, then back at his mother. Sarah reached out, gently touching his head. No, buddy, she said softly, I'm going to get her help, I promise. Max whimpered, again nudging Sarah's hand as if asking her to hurry. Sarah nodded, her mind already planning what to do next. She needed to get Roxy back to the station and call in for help, but the storm was making it nearly impossible to travel. Her radio crackled in her pocket, but the connection was weak, the storm interfering with any signal. Come on, she whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. You've done tough things before, you can do this now. She helped Roxy into a sitting position, and the dog let out a soft sigh of relief, as if the act of being cared for, of not being alone, gave her a small measure of comfort. Max stayed close to her mother, his little body pressed against hers as though trying to share his warmth. The wind howled even louder as Sarah lifted Roxy, her muscles straining against the weight. With Max leading the way, Sarah began to make her way back to the patrol car, her heart pounding with urgency. The storm was unforgiving, but she couldn't afford to let the weather stop her. She had to get them to safety. Every step felt like an eternity. The cold was biting, and the snow seemed to fall even harder the farther they went, but with each step, Sarah's resolve grew stronger. She couldn't leave Roxy and Max out in the storm. They needed her, and she wasn't about to let them down after what felt like an eternity. Sarah reached the patrol car, pulling open the door and gently setting Roxy and Max inside. She looked at them, her heart aching with compassion. I'm not leaving you, she whispered. We'll get through this, I promise. As she climbed into the driver's seat, her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her eyes scanning the road ahead. She wasn't sure how far they'd have to go, or if she'd even make it to help in time. But in that moment, Sarah knew one thing for sure: Roxy and Max had found their way to her for a reason, and she wasn't going to let them down. The storm outside showed no signs of easing as Sarah drove through the thick snowfall, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the view clear. The patrol car's headlights illuminated the swirling snowflakes, casting a ghostly glow over the road ahead. With Roxy resting in the back seat and Max curled up beside her, Sarah focused on keeping her mind sharp. The wind howled through the car, and Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had made it out of the woods with Roxy and Max, but the nearest animal hospital was still miles away. She had called for backup, but it would take time for anyone to reach her in these conditions. The snow was falling harder and the temperature was dropping quickly. Come on, Sarah muttered to herself, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the icy road. You can do this. Max let out a low whine from the back seat, and Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror to see him staring up at Roxy, who was still breathing softly but weakly. The sight of the puppy's worried eyes tugged at her heart, and she spoke to him softly. It's going to be okay, Max, she reassured him, her voice gentle but steady. We getting there, Max responded with a soft whimper, his eyes never leaving his mother. Sarah's heart swelled with emotion as she realized just how deeply connected they were. The bond between the two was undeniable. Max was not just a puppy following someone for help. He was following his instinct, his love for his mother driving him to find safety. As Sarah drove, her thoughts turned to Roxy. She had never seen a dog so badly injured, and yet there was something in her eyes, a quiet determination to stay alive. Sarah could tell that Roxy wasn't giving up, but she knew that they were running out of time. The sooner they reached help, the better. The road was treacherous, and Sarah had to drive slowly to avoid sliding on the slick surface. The car's tires struggled to grip the road, and the heavy snow made it difficult to see anything ahead. Sarah kept her focus, making sure to steer with care even as the storm worsened. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually Sarah began to see the lights of the animal hospital up ahead. The relief that waves over her was overwhelming. She had made it. Roxy and Max would get the help they so desperately needed. As Sarah pulled into the parking lot, she took a deep breath, finally allowing herself a moment of calm. The storm outside was still fierce, but they had made it through. She quickly turned off the engine and opened the door. Rushing around to the back of the car, she gently helped Roxy out, first making sure not to jostle her injured body. Max followed closely behind, his tiny body trembling as he walked beside Sarah, staying as close to his mother as possible. The lights inside the animal hospital were bright and welcoming, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope. The staff had been prepped and were already waiting for her. They rushed over to take Roxy and Max, their expert hands working quickly to assess the situation. Is she going to be okay? Sarah asked, her voice thick with worry. One of the veterinarians, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked at Sarah with a reassuring smile. We're going to do everything we can, she said. She's a strong girl and we've got the resources to help her. Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders as she watched the staff take charge. Roxy and Max were in good hands now, but the emotional toll of the journey, the exhaustion and the worry began to hit Sarah all at once. She leaned against the wall of the hospital, feeling the full weight of everything she had just been through. Max, still trembling, stood by her side, looking up at her with those wide, trusting eyes. He nuzzled her hand gently, and Sarah knelt down to pet him. You did great, Max, she whispered. Your mom's going to be okay. You got her here. The puppy's tail wagged softly as he licked her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. It was as if he was telling her in his own way that he trusted her completely. A few minutes later, the veterinarian returned to give Sarah an update. Roxy is stable for now, she said. Her paw is badly injured, but we're going to start treatment immediately. The puppies are in good shape too. We just need to keep an eye on them for a while. Sarah let out a sigh of relief, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had done it. She had saved them. Roxy and Max would recover, and they would have a second chance at life. Max jumped up onto Sarah's lap, curling up against her chest, as if to say thank you. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. In that moment she realized just how deeply Her life had changed, she had saved them. But in doing so they had saved her too. They had all found something in each other: hope, love, and a bond that couldn't be broken. The hours following Roxy and Max's arrival at the animal hospital were filled with a mix of anxious waiting and cautious hope. Sarah had not left their side, sitting in a quiet corner of the waiting room, her mind racing as she thought about everything they had been through. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling and sending flurries of snow against the windows. It felt as though the world was frozen in time, but inside the warmth of the hospital there was a flicker of life, of possibility. Roxy was in stable condition, but it was clear that she had a long road ahead. The veterinarian Dr. Harrison had explained that her paw was badly fractured and infected, but they would do everything they could to help her recover. Max, despite his exhaustion, seemed to be in relatively good health, though he was still nervous, constantly checking on his mother and snuggling close to Sarah. His small body trembled occasionally, but Sarah could sense his relief now that they were safe. As the hours passed, Sarah sat with Max, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the puppy's courage and determination. It was clear to her now that Max had led her to Roxy for a reason. He had known she needed help, and his loyalty to his mother had been unwavering. But it wasn't just Max who had saved the day. Sarah knew she had played her part too. She had pushed through her own doubts and fears, risking everything to bring them both to safety. As she watched Max lie peacefully on the couch beside her, her heart swelled with pride and love. The door to the room opened and Dr. Harrison walked in with a gentle smile on her face. "I've got good news," she said, her voice soft but reassuring. "Roxy is doing better. We've cleaned and bandaged her paw and she's resting now. She's still weak, but she's a fighter." Tears of relief welled up in Sarah's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Dr. Harrison smiled and patted Sarah on the shoulder. "It's our job to help you. Brought them here, and that's what made all the difference." Sarah nodded, her heart full of gratitude. She couldn't believe how much she had come to care for these animals in such a short amount of time. They weren't just a mother and puppy to her, they were a family now. She had made a promise to them, and she would keep it. Over the next few days, Roxy and Max slowly began to recover. The vet staff monitored them closely, making sure they were both comfortable and safe. Roxy's condition improved steadily, and Max's nervousness began to fade as he adjusted to their new routine. During this time, Sarah continued to visit them daily. She spent hours sitting with Max, watching him grow stronger as he began to trust the hospital staff. He would curl up in her lap, his small body warm against hers, and for a brief moment Sarah could forget the storm that had brought them here. But as the days went on, Sarah couldn't help but think about what would come next. They couldn't stay at the hospital forever. Roxy and Max would need a home, a place where they could heal and find peace, and Sarah knew she would do whatever it took to provide that for them. One afternoon, as Sarah sat by Roxy's side, the dog's eyes opened, and she lifted her head, her gaze locking with Sarah's. There was a silent understanding between them, a shared bond that had grown from the stormy night in the woods to the hospital, and now to this moment of quiet reflection. "You're going to be okay, Roxy," Sarah whispered, gently brushing the dog's fur. "I'll make sure of it. You and Max have a future, and I'm going to give you both the best chance." Roxy let out a soft sigh, resting her head back on the blanket. Max, now fully awake, scampered over to Sarah's lap and nuzzled her hand. His small body felt light and full of energy. The transformation from the fragile puppy she had met in the snow to this confident little dog was miraculous. Max looked up at Sarah, his eyes bright with trust. He had come to her for help, and now she was there for him in that moment. Sarah knew that this was only the beginning of their journey together. The days at the hospital had passed slowly, but steadily, each one bringing a small step toward recovery for both Roxy and Max. Sarah's routine had changed since they arrived. She now spent her free time at the hospital focused on their healing. She was determined to make sure they were both ready for the next chapter of their lives, but the storm outside still lingered, casting an unsettling shadow over everything. Sarah could feel the pressure mounting while Roxy's injury was slowly improving. The road to full recovery was still uncertain. The doctors were doing their best to manage her pain, but there were moments when Sarah could see the exhaustion in the dog's eyes. As strong as she was, there were limits to how much even the most resilient could endure. One evening, after a long day of checking in with the veterinary staff, Sarah stayed a little longer than usual. The hospital was quieter than it had been in days, and she found herself sitting by Roxy's side, her thoughts drifting. She couldn't help but think about what would come next once they were ready to leave the hospital. Where would they go? She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: she couldn't let them go. Max, now fully recovered and full of energy, was a whirlwind of excitement. His playful antics had brought a sense of joy and lightness to the hospital, and Sarah couldn't help but smile whenever he bounded toward her with that wide-eyed innocence only a puppy could possess. Yet, even with his playful nature, there was still an underlying sense of fear. Max, much like his mother, had been through more than any animal should ever have to face. One evening, as Sarah was feeding Roxy, the dog seemed to stiffen suddenly, her eyes wide in panic. Max immediately reacted, running to her side and barking urgently. Sarah jumped to her feet, her heart racing as she looked at Roxy. "What's wrong, girl?" Sarah asked softly, her voice filled with concern. She reached out to soothe the dog, but the tension in Roxy's body only grew stronger. Max was now standing protectively in front of her, his small body quivering with anxiety. Dr. Harrison quickly entered the room, sensing the urgency in the air. "What's going on?" "Roxy's having some trouble," Sarah said, her voice tight. "She's never acted like this before." The veterinarian immediately began examining Roxy, her calm demeanor helping to ease Sarah's growing worry. She carefully checked the dog's vital signs, but it quickly became clear that Roxy was experiencing severe anxiety. The trauma of the past few days had taken its toll on her, and the emotional weight of everything she had endured was now catching up with her. "We need to keep her calm," Dr. Har explained gently. "It's natural for animals who've been through traumatic experiences to have moments like this: the storm, the pain, the fear. It all adds up." Sarah nodded, her heartbreaking for Roxy. She had already come so far, but now it seemed as though they were facing yet another obstacle. She watched as Max lay down next to Roxy, his head resting gently on her side, offering silent comfort. The puppy's presence seemed to calm the dog, and slowly the tension in her body eased. "You're a good boy, Max," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. As the hours passed, Sarah remained by their side, her thoughts racing. She couldn't let Roxy's trauma hold them back, not now, not when they were so close to recovery. She had promised both of them that she would get them through this, and she wasn't going to break that promise. The next morning Roxy seemed a little better. Her breathing had slowed, and she looked up at Sarah with tired but grateful eyes. Max, as usual, was by her side, the two of them a perfect picture of resilience and loyalty. Sarah smiled softly, watching the bond between mother and son. They had come so far together, and no matter what obstacles lay ahead, they would face them as a family. Later that day, Dr. Harrison came in with a hopeful expression. "Roxy's improving. We've managed to reduce the anxiety, and she's responding well to the treatment. It looks like she'll be able To go home soon. Sarah's heart soared. With relief she had been waiting for this moment, but it still felt surreal. Roxy and Max had made it through the worst of it, and now they were going to have a future together. As she looked at the two of them lying in the quiet room, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. These animals had come into her life at a time when she needed them most. They had given her purpose, and now it was her turn to give them the life they deserve. The days had become warmer, and the heavy snow that had once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle had slowly started to melt away. The storm was nothing but a memory now, a reminder of how fragile everything had seemed, but through it all Sarah had remained steadfast. She had fought for Roxy and Max, and now it was time to rebuild their lives. Sarah's time at the animal hospital had come to an end, with Roxy's injuries healing and Max's playful energy back in full force. The three of them had formed an unbreakable bond, but Sarah knew that their journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning. They still needed a home, a place where they could live in peace away from the storms and dangers they had faced. Sarah had already made up her mind. She was going to adopt Roxy and Max. She couldn't imagine life without them. The day they left the hospital, Sarah felt a sense of closure, but also a new kind of responsibility. Roxy and Max were her family now. As she drove them back to her apartment, the world felt different, as if everything had aligned to bring them together. The puppy, now full of life and energy, sat happily on her lap, his tail wagging furiously as he gazed out the window. Roxy lay quietly at Sarah's feet, her body still healing but her eyes filled with gratitude. The trio made their way into their new home, a home where they would heal together. Over the next few weeks, Sarah did everything she could to make their lives comfortable. The apartment was small, but it was filled with love. Roxy had a cozy bed by the window where she could watch the birds and the squirrels outside. Max had a small corner for his toys, and every morning he would excitedly race to fetch his favorite ball. Sarah's days were filled with walks, playtime, and training sessions with Max. She watched as he grew stronger and more confident, his playful nature emerging in ways she hadn't expected. Roxy, though still cautious, began to trust her surroundings more and more. The bond between them grew deeper each day, and Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how much they had all changed. One afternoon, after a long walk through the park, Sarah sat on a bench with Max on her lap and Roxy by her side. She watched as Max chased after a stick, barking excitedly, his tail wagging like a little motor. Roxy sat calmly beside Sarah, her eyes soft and content. The quiet moments like this were the ones Sarah cherished most, the moments where everything felt right. As the sun set on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, Sarah reflected on the journey she had taken with Roxy and Max. They had come so far from that first night in the storm. They had survived against the odds, and now they had found peace. Max ran back to her, his little body out of breath but filled with joy. He jumped into her lap, nuzzling her hand with his nose. Roxy looked at him fondly, then at Sarah, as if silently agreeing that this was the life they had all fought for. "We made it," Sarah whispered softly, her voice filled with emotion. "We made it through." Max licked her face, and Roxy let out a soft sigh, resting her head on Sarah's lap. In that moment, Sarah realized that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about love, loyalty, and the beautiful bond that had been created between them. As she looked at the two of them, Sarah knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. They had survived the storm, and now they were building a life full of hope, happiness, and love. Their journey had not been easy, but it had brought them closer, teaching them all the true meaning of family. Roxy, Max, and Sarah's journey was one of resilience, love, and hope. Together they faced unimaginable challenges, but in the and they found the strength to build a new life. This story shows us that no matter the obstacles, love can lead us to a brighter future. If this story touch your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in second chances and the unbreakable bond between animals and humans. Let's spread the message of love and hope.